So I'll just say hello and welcome, and Dave Kennedy would be here if he could, but he had to be in two places at once today. So thank you all very much for joining. Now this is our first Friday's monthly webinar, and we actually have the honor of guests today, which is a special presentation with Vince Calhoun and Theo, talking about an overview of COINSTAC with an application, practical application to analysis, and they're going to do a tag team presentation, and we're looking forward to it. And Yark will do a little introduction for us, please.
Oh, well, not sure how much of introduction is needed, especially for Vince. But those who don't know Vince somehow, what is most interesting for me that Vince is engineer. So he's not neuroscientist by training, right? So you had lots of...
I don't know anything about the brain at all.
There we go, there we go. So that's a good company, especially in my case too. I never took official neuroscience course. Vince was also the chair of HBM for the past 2020 year, right? The year of 2020.
I was the outgoing chair last year. Yeah, you're kind of a 3-year term, and so that was my third year. Yeah.
Oh, right. So
I was the chair during the Rome meeting and the past chair during the virtual meeting last year.
I see.
So don't blame me.
Okay. I'll shut off here. And Theo, unfortunately, we didn't socialize as much as with Vince, so I don't know much about Theo besides that he's coming from UC Irvine, right? To us. Yes, and he's actually the one who knows the brains, right? So it's a good tandem there, an engineer and neuroscientist, and they'll talk to us about COINSTAC. And again, I've placed our fearless leader, Dave Kennedy, behind me on the wall. So he is with us as well. So if you missed him, at least observe this picture while it's there. And so the stage is yours, Vince and Theo.
Okay, great. And yeah, I guess a number of us were connected. Theo and David and others were connected from the FBurn projects and the Burn project, you know, from years ago, and sort of an earlier iteration, as well as many others on this call too. So. So I'll go fairly quickly, just a sort of overview. What I'm going to do is give an overview of what COINSTAC is and what we're trying to do with it, and what we have currently working in the tool. And then Theo will talk about a newer phase where we're kind of working with the ENIGMA group to help them facilitate some analyses within the COINSTAC framework. And so he'll be able to kind of show some of the things that they've been doing with that, and that's also with Jess Turner. So there's a couple things, there's sort of two main things that we're trying to do with COINSTAC in terms of what's the need. And one is privacy, which is that in some cases it's hard to share data. You may not have the right, at least in the past, right? There's a lot of data that IRBs won't let you share, including FBurn phase 3 data. You know, there's also issues related to sharing sometimes across international boundaries and other types of things like that, rare diseases. If you think about privacy, that you can think about it in sort of a taxonomy where there's plausible privacy, meaning I'm just sharing, like I'm sharing derivatives openly or things like that, and so doesn't look like it's identifying, and we assume it's not, although with machine learning it could be, right? There's definitionally private, and that would be like PHI, right? So you have those 17, different, variables that are mechanistically defined as sensitive. Quantifiably private would be like a computational method, like differential privacy, where you're adding or obscuring the data with some noise, and then you're denoising it when you compute a result from it, and you can quantify in these methods. The more that the method gets used, the less private it becomes. It's sort of a leakage measure, and so there's like a privacy budget, things like that. And then encryption would be like like a sort of bank level in encryption at all stages, which would be the most private. Another thing that COINSTAC can help with beyond privacy is big data issues, where maybe we have a large data set that has thousands or tens of thousands of subjects in one location and another data set in another location, maybe something we collected or someone else's collected, and we don't want to spend the resources or the time to put all that in one place. And so we can use a decentralized analysis tool to coordinate that by essentially having the analysis run locally and aggregating the data. And I'll get into that more in the subsequent slides here. So that's what COINSTAC is trying to do, is by essentially keeping data local and performing analysis via consortia, which are created by one of the sites that have the data, and the analysis is then done in sort of a decentralized, or now the term popularized by Google is federated learning. And so it allows you to collaborate with researchers around the world. It lets you do advanced analysis, so you can do machine learning and iterative approaches. You can use different types of privacy, and it doesn't transmit the original data. On the right, you can see some of the tech stack that we use in the application itself. So it's essentially a standalone application which can run on Windows, Mac, or Linux. That you would download. It's open source and freely available, and the computations, as we call them, with that the application uses are running within a containerized environment. So they're Docker based, or we're adding Singularity support as well. And you can run computations. I think this group is well aware within those containers using pretty much any programming language. So here's just sort of a snapshot of some of the, how the user interface looks. You have a login, and then you basically have consortia that can be created, and people that have data can join those consortia. And each consortia maps their own data, and no one else sees that mapping or that individual level data. If you want a sort of a launch point, you can go to this website, coinstac.org, and that'll point you to all the resources we have in terms of where the code is and what the publications are, et cetera. So I've kind of covered this, but basically we have sites that are running the COINSTAC application. Depending on what computation they set up, it downloads the appropriate container to run that computation. I'll just kind of step you through three parts of a simple workflow that we can use, which involves how do you set it up, how do you fit the data, and then aggregating the data. And so here we have kind of a central node, which is used for both authentication as well as for aggregation. And then you have these individual sites, each of which have their own data. And so what you do is, given, say, in this case, we have two variables, age and is a control or a patient, and then an imaging variable, which might be volume, say from FreeSurfer. And one site decides to create a consortia, which they pick a model and they pick a testing framework that they want to use, which defines the computation. That goes and gets sent to the individual sites, who then do mapping of those variables to their own data. So those might have different labels, different names, et cetera. And then the fitting stage is basically running that model locally, and then returning the parameter fits to the central site. And finally, I keep getting all these admit people coming in. Finally, we have this, you know, once the model is aggregated, the results are aggregated, that those get returned to the individual sites who can then visualize the results. So it's all, you know, you see the group level results, you can see them by site, you don't see any individual subject data. Here's just a simple example for an output from, say, a free surfer regression, where, you know, you can see beta values, p-values, t-values for, you know, in this case we had is control and age in the model. Here you see it for the global and for two of the 3 sites here. So just as, again, an overview, we have the key components are the application, which is downloaded locally. And then we have computations, and there's 2 types of computations. There's a local computation, which would be something like pre-processing that doesn't need any information about the group level data. So I want to run, you know, just run free surfer, or I want to do segmentation on that individual data set, for example. And then decentralized computations would be things that need to build parameters from the entire data set. And then we have the output, which are tables and images and files. Here's just a visualization of the architecture. You know, so for people that want to build computations, there's really just 2 pieces to it. You have an input that is to the local data, and then you have an input to an iterative process that basically churns across all of the other data sites. And again, that can be sort of a single pass, or it can be multi-pass. We have a simulator, which is used for people that want to, again, build computations so that they can test the application without having to work with actual people. They can just work within the simulator and create sites and run their code and get it working within the COINSTAC infrastructure. Here on the left, you can see just a long list of the different computations that we have already implemented and put into the application, including regression, voxel-based morphometry. We've got group ICA and some other things. I'll show some examples of those later. We have a number of other things that are coming that are in the pipeline. The ones here that are starred, we've already built the algorithms and got the code working, but it's not into the application just yet. So we're because that requires building the graphical interface and the input and the output data pipelines and other things. Here's just an example of some of the output from a VBM analysis, looking at regression, where here you basically get images out. So this is a beta map for age. This is the intercept term, and then there was one here for gender as well. Here's another example looking at group ICA, where you have components and their spectra, and you can do stats on these, and you can look at functional network connectivity and other things. We've also implemented a dynamic connectivity pipeline within COINSTAC, which essentially lets you take fMRI data and it goes through ICA, and then you can compute network connectivity matrices, which are clustered into sort of transient states. So these are transient connectivity patterns showing down here. One of the challenges with a decentralized analysis is that you don't get to look at the data yourself, right? So that's a big issue, because you know, how do you curate the data? And so we're trying to get at this by, you know, computing various quality control metrics, but also trying to visualize, you know, using TSNE, you know, approaches, for example. This is just showing an example in the MNIST data. This was a fun one to decentralize, because to get this to work, we had to create a pooled shared data set that the local sites had to reference against in order to get it to work well. But again, it gives you this sort of, each dot here would be in this case, it's a number, but in the imaging case, it would be an imaging data set, or a subject rather. We've got the sort of bare bones of a decentralized neural network approach, and we are working on a sort of, in the new phase of COINSTAC, which just got funded, we're working on developing more efficient neural network approaches so that we can fully deploy deep learning type models. That's going to require interfacing with GPU systems and things like that, so it's a little tricky. Passing around huge parameter sets in an efficient way, and things like that. Those are the things we're kind of working on. We also have a classifier. In this case, this is a support vector machine one that is also implemented in a differentially private framework. As I mentioned before, you essentially add noise to the data before you pass it, so that it can't be easily identified even via machine learning. So this one we did a few years ago, but this is just showing an example where individual sites had a classification error of about 25%. And if we aggregate, we get, using this differentially private SVM, the error drops to about 5%. And here's one that we have just developed. Again, it's not in the application yet, but the algorithm is working, which is a decentralized joint ICA, which is also differentially private. Another layer of privacy, and this is a newer one that we're working on. We have the initial, working with Daniel Takabi here at GSU, something called secure multi-party computation, which is essentially an encryption-based approach. So we basically encrypt the data, so we encrypt the derivatives before they get passed centrally as well. So this is even more private. So again, there's like a spectrum of privacy, and those come with trade-offs. And so this is a lossless and fully encrypted way to do computations. We have a lot of things that we're working on going forward, including some genetics pipelines, other modalities, white matter hyperintensity, ASL, diffusion imaging, and source-based morphometry, which is multivariate EBM, essentially. A couple examples of how we've used this to do some actual research. We've worked with the Global Imaging Genetics of Adolescence group, the GIGA group, led by Gunter Schumann, to do an initial VBM analysis. And Theo will be talking about the work with the ENIGMA group in a second. Here's an example of the VBM output from the GIGA analysis, and this was sort of our first use of an image-based analysis within COINSTAC. So, so we have voxel-wise maps of age, of smoking, of BMI in about 2,400 subjects across 14 sites, but they were run through 3 COINSTAC nodes. And so then I will pass it off to Theo now. You've got the links to the software, and this is the group at Trends, and there's been a lot of work across many people to kind of get these tools working. And we'd love for others to get involved and work with us, and we're happy to work with anybody on this.
While he's setting up, Vince, I have just a couple questions, and we may not get to them. That's fine. So one question I have is, so the computational, the algorithms, if one was to write their own algorithm for COINSTAC, that would be written in like Python. I also saw something like JavaScript running in your little example.
Yeah, so they work basically within a Docker container, and you can write them in anything you want.
Okay.
You'd have to just be able to interface with the input and the output for COINSTAC. So some of the ones we have are using the runtime environment in MATLAB. and some of them are using Python, and we have some in R. So I think we have at least those 3 already examples. So.
And then also real quick, you said you add noise to the derivatives at each site, then that gets sent back to the central node, and I see. So well, that's interesting. So, and there's no problem with that noise, being a confound in the meta-analysis?
So there's a parameter. So that this, and I didn't really go into the details. I could give another talk on sort of differential privacy approaches, but it's basically a parameter, and the parameter is, the trade-off is more noise, more private, but more noisy, right? And yeah. So the more you increase that, the harder it is also to estimate and get good performance. And so there's a trade-off there, and it takes a little while to get these algorithms to work well. But they do give you a real the value is that it gives you a way to quantify probabilistically a privacy budget based on what you're passing off to the individual that's analyzing it. So it has a lot of advantages to it.
So I think everybody probably knows ENIGMA, but just in case not, it's like Enhancing Neuroimaging Genetics Through Meta-Analysis, a large consortium that was initially started by Jason Stein and Paul Thompson to try and identify genes, which was hard to do in individual samples. So the idea was to combine imaging and genetics data from lots of different groups and then do meta-analysis, basically. And so this subsequently was funded. So there's a lot of groups involved all around the world now. There's about 51 working groups. I think it's more than 34 disorders that are being examined now in basically all over the world. And the way the consortium is organized, it basically ended up getting funding from a BD2K award. And it's funded in non-clinical groups that develop methods, basically imaging methods or imaging genetics methods. And then there are that are also being used then by clinical working groups. And Jessica Turner and I are leading are co-chairing the schizophrenia working group. And we thought that, hey, this COINSTAC is like a great way to combine analyses within ENIGMA, basically. So what are these ENIGMA disorder working groups trying to do, basically, is we try to do perspective meta or mega analysis. And basically, so what we're doing is jointly analyzing data. So rather than going into the literature, pulling findings together and doing a meta analysis, we actually try to analyze data in the same way, use similar QC procedures and the same statistics, then pull that data together and do rank ordering, basically, of disease-related effects of different types of brain measures, examine factors that may moderate these effect sizes, and also we are able to compare effects across disorder that way. So the analysis approach that we have been taking so far has been to run a particular analysis. We started with free surfers, fairly easy to do for everyone, and then extract volumetric data, have standardized QC procedures. And what we do is we send around our scripts to run analyses, and then people will send the results of those analyses back. And then we do, and then at the local at one site that then ends up leading that particular analysis, we do the meta-analysis. And this is also going back to what COINSTAC enables, is that there are still sites that cannot share data, including, I have a data set myself that we can't share because the IRB just doesn't allow us to. So I think, for instance, in the schizophrenia working group, I think we may have about, out of 60 plus sites, we may have about a little bit more than half that can share actual individual subject level data, and others cannot. What I really like about this is that because we're all using similar data analysis approaches, we can generate results that are similar, basically, so we can compare across different disorders. right now only with structural imaging data, but and diffusion tensor imaging data. But there are now 2 ENIGMA resting state pipelines that are being introduced. And I think with COINSTAC, actually, with Vince's entire toolbox, I think it can really take off very nicely to facilitate doing these types of analyses across the different ENIGMA working groups. So as I mentioned, basically what we've done so far is doing image analysis and some automation using Linux shell scripts. And we create standardized CSV files. We produce R scripts that get sent around to sites, and then the results are tarred up and sent back to the main analysis site. And through COINSTAC, we can more easily automate some of these things. So like, for instance, we don't need to ask people to install R and make sure that they have all the packages that they need. If we have a Dockerized version of R available through COINSTAC, including the scripts that we want to run, then we basically don't require any skills. We don't even need someone to know how to zip up a file anymore. Basically, it also enables clinicians who don't do any image analysis at all, potentially, to map a data set and contribute to an analysis. So enabling federated data analysis. Vince has already shown this slide. Basically, the idea is that you have individuals. There will be a lead consortium that proposes an analysis, and then individual sites can join that analysis. So really the processing for COINSTAC begins with the lead site defining a local and global analysis. The local analysis is in COINSTAC is downloaded. Currently Docker, but I think in the future Singularity images will also hopefully be available, because a lot of, for instance, high performance compute clusters, of course, cannot run or don't allow running Docker. So the computation for the local analysis is done at the local site, and then the results are, rather than being sent as a zip file, are sent via FTP or file transfer protocol, I guess, to a lead site. So participating sites basically do the same type of thing that they would do in the analysis, where we send our code around. They format their data into some standard format that can be, and then they map their data. And in our case, we only map CSV files. So we map CSV files. And then the analysis will run at the local site, and once it's completed, return it the intermediate data to the lead site. So I'll skip this one. So so with Jessica, Vince, and I basically ended up submitting an R01 to further develop COINSTAC for ENIGMA. And we based this on an idea of looking at negative symptom domains. What was nice is that Strauss in 2018 actually published a paper where he sort of laid out the framework for RDoC constructs related to negative symptom domains. And he also linked that to brain structure circuits, basically. So we figured this is great. We can use this as an idea to do some science, but at the same time develop COINSTAC within the ENIGMA schizophrenia working group, but also like then involve the bipolar working group and MDD, major depressive disorder working group, because some similar measures are also collected in those working groups. So just a brief overview. We've already gone over this a little bit, and Vince as well. So consortium leader basically, defines a consortium and selects or creates or selects an analysis pipeline. Then members can join the consortium. When they join the consortium, a Dockerized version of an analysis pipeline that was defined by the consortium leader is downloaded. The members then map their data for analysis, and then the consortium leader analyzes the pipeline. So the first analysis that we started in the ENIGMA schizophrenia working group, basically, for this was to what the analysis does basically is we provide it with raw scale of assessment of negative symptoms, basically measures. So based on Strauss's work, it then computes factor scores, and then it runs regressions between these factor scores and deep brain structure volumes, cortical thickness, and surface area. That's probably enough here. So actually, we actually did a first run. Well, of course, we piloted between Jess and I and Ross, who was on Vince's team, who helped develop the COINSTAC implementation of the pipeline. And then we did a first real test in June, where we had 7 sites joined, and we ended up with 2 issues. One was some lack of robustness in the R script. It didn't check whether all the appropriate files were mapped and didn't give a proper error back for that. And there was one large file that didn't transfer. So some of these issues were fixed, and then we ran a successful initial analysis in July. So just briefly, Vince has already gone over this as well, but where you can download COINSTAC. I think the current version, at least when I checked this morning, was version 4.7.5 as a binary release. There's also source code available. When you download it, you know, and uncompress it, you get a little COINSTAC tool that you can just double click on and it will launch. You end up getting a login menu, so you can sign up and get your own account name with password. And in most cases, I still used one of the test passwords. But then when you log in, basically, it will show you home, maps, computations, consortia, pipelines, results, and logs in the initial menu. So in the computations, this is where most of Vince's team basically puts different pipelines that have been created, Dockerized versions of pipelines. And you can also add your own. So Vince, I don't actually really know, if you were to add your own, where would that computation live? Does it then live on your server, or does it live on the local?
It would be in the, I mean, it would be eventually put in the Docker hub.
Okay.
And so then there'd be 2 steps, right? So building the computation and getting it to work in simulator is the first step. And then the second step is integrating it into the application. And so we're hoping to streamline that process, but right now we basically have to build it in one by one. So
yeah, okay. Yeah. Then there's the pipeline menu, and there you can define pipelines for a particular consortium. That's also not exactly clear to me, because you have the computations and you have the pipeline menu. I know when you define a consortium, you also define the pipeline, and I'm assuming the pipeline can use any of the tools that are in the computations toolbox. Am I correct on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so that's a slight little difference there. Then there is the consortium menu, where you can start a new consortium. So you give the consortium a name, and then after you've given it a name, you pull in a pipeline that you want to run. Of course, you can leave a consortium that you've joined. You can map your data to a consortium, and just if you log in as if you want to join a consortium, basically, so a lead consortium member or the leader will tell you, hey, we have this consortium, do you want to join it? Then you can log in and, of course, join the consortium and map your data. So in our case, mapping the data was basically, so after logging in as a member, joining the consortium, you can basically add files, and we had pre-specified what those files should look like. For instance, the SANS CSV file should have 25 measures, SANS 1 to SANS 25, with the different symptom measures in it for each of the patients, and then structural data and some covariates. We also included a cohort info file that basically also gets transferred, which we've started doing even with our scripts, so that where we know when we get data back, we for sure know what the cohort name is, and the email address and contact information of the person who analyzed the data, because that can get, it's easy to have that handy if you're working with 60+ sites. In this case, we only ran 7, but so then once the data is mapped, the consortium leader basically launches the pipeline, and then can. So you actually first of course you want to check that every site has mapped their data, so you can actually see that in this consortium menu with little green circles with checkboxes. If everyone has successfully mapped their data, you can launch the pipeline, and then you get a menu. You can look at a menu basically where you can look at the status of the local pipelines that are running at each of the different sites, and then once all of those are completed and have sent their data over, a local, in this case, meta-analysis pipeline will start. That's of course maybe not always necessary. You can set pipelines up in different ways. You could even have, I think, just have the local results be pulled over to the central site and run the meta-analysis separately. That's possible too. And then, of course, the nice thing is once you get your results back, you can see, and then the hard work starts of trying to make sense out of it. So
it doesn't interpret the results for you, huh?
Not yet.
We're trying to get that tool.
Yeah. So I think, so from my perspective, at least for a consortium like ENIGMA, this federated data analysis approach is brilliant. It allows for lots of different things that currently are probably not, or at least seem not possible, especially things like machine learning. Of course, so it helps with each of these different issues that I think are advantages of multi-site collaborations. It will increase power, because some site, like right now, if we're doing a mega analysis, again, we can only have half of the sites. So if we wanted to do a machine learning analysis, we'd only have half of the data that we could be using. Well, through this federated analysis approach, we could, we could include all the different sites. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to using more of the COINSTAC abilities in our working group. And then just to thank everyone, of course, like Vince's group and Jess's group, and then there aren't 1,400, but these are at least some of the PIs from all the ENIGMA working groups.
Well, great. Thank you so much, actually. And there's actually time for questions, so I imagine there will be some, but it's really nice to have overviews so nicely distilled for the rest of us. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, Dave, your turn then.
So this is a quick question for Theo. Well, or it could be for Vince, either way. So interesting presentation on the use of ENIGMA and COINSTAC. I was wondering, so I was thinking about ENIGMA, and so do you require the sites to have the imaging and behavioral data in any specific format? I assume the answer is no. So my follow-up question would then be, are you worried about like behavioral scores, the ranges of variables and categorical mappings and things being different amongst your sites? And if the answer to that is yes, then do you think that some of the newer IDM work might help you in terms of building sort of automated mapping functions to map across data dictionaries from the different sites, if in fact the categorical mappings are different for these sorts of meta-analyses?
Yeah, I absolutely think that. So basically, we've taken a very top-down approach in ENIGMA with everything we do, basically. So it's so everything is defined. So for instance, the sans variables, even though the names are not great, sans 1 to 25, there are different versions of the sans. Some have more or fewer items. So, but what we do is when we ask sites to map these, is we provide them with the version of the sans variables. So they do need to check. But I think a much better approach, and also for the future, even for working with COINSTAC and being able to pull, or basically right now we have air, but we don't have fair. That's what it comes down to, right? We can do analysis but finding the data basically is now a completely social and human enterprise. The data is not sitting somewhere already mapped with appropriate labels. So I think down the line, having that with NIDM or some other way to do that is the way to go.
To interrupt.
Oh,
I was just going to say, so you do like an NDAR approach where everybody maps their local assessments to some standard, some common.
Right. Yeah. So we provide, for instance, yeah, exactly. We provide a spreadsheet. These are the variables, and these are the definitions of the variables, and sites fill that in. But it's not what I would prefer, because it's actually very time consuming. It takes sites a long time. You know, if you have 60 sites, basically you send them a spreadsheet with how to map things, and it's actually also inefficient, right? So because if this can be done bottom up as you're collecting data, and it can be automated basically, right, to a large extent.
But BIDS isn't required.
BIDS is currently not required.
Okay. Thank you.
well, one thing just in terms of getting to the F is we are working towards that in terms of COINSTAC, and it makes less sense for these kind of transient consortia, but what we're also working on is essentially like a sort of a headless COINSTAC, which would be like a persistent COINSTAC. So imagine you've got a large sort of curated data set, and you want to just make that available for anyone to build a consortia with all the time. And so it's kind of like set up as a service, and a remote site could then, you know, basically connect with it. And so that data set, you can imagine basically broadcasting metadata and making it, you know, available through various search engines, et cetera. So, and then, you know, maybe also could address some of the mapping issues that you mentioned by, you know, providing a standard there. So,
yeah. And then following up on sort of the mappings, I mean, in ReproNim, we've been experimenting and actually have a small test environment of COINSTAC up where we've, you know, been using NIDM. So if you go to the BIDS NIDM conversion, you know, with the PyNIDM query functionality where you can distribute a query across COINSTAC. So that's one of the things that we're experimenting with, is if you do have the markup.
that's awesome.
Then you can query across that. So
Yeah, I had no idea. That's great. I didn't know you had moved forward with that. So that's really great to hear. So, yeah.
But actually, so for instance, the variable mappings in the schizophrenia working group, they're not huge. It might be fairly easy actually to provide NIDM descriptions for those. So I don't think that's going to be really hard to do.
I mean, I was just thinking like you could, I mean, I don't know if, you know, people are using RedCap or whatever they're using to collect their assessment data, but yeah, there are tools, right, just to take the assessment data without any of the imaging data and create these metadata descriptor files, which would have your data dictionary information in it that you could use to remap variables.
Yeah, what has become quite clear to me is that not all sites have their data in electronic format, because
well, that's a requirement.
Accessible format, because it can take a really long time for people to pull data together from their samples.
Yeah, and if they did have it in BIDS and it was actually even managed with DataLad, then you could take one more step and from those metadata files use the URLs to go out and potentially get images. I mean, it would be local, right? Because this is a local analysis, but you could presumably kind of do that, and the user might not have to click, here's my anatomical image, because you could search that metadata record, say, oh, I know where the anatomical image is. So, anyway, thanks.
So this is a question kind of piggybacking on the data side, the container side or the app side. At present, sounds like somebody has to do that impedance matching between what's expected by the container and where the data are stored. So are the COINSTAC clients capable of hooking onto local HPC resources so that I could kind of scale up the computation? For certain things, it might be simple enough to work on CSV files or other things, but if I had to do kind of larger scale processing where the app was free server or something, I wouldn't necessarily want to run it on my laptop or my local server.
Yeah.
Could I connect it with the HPC center?
Yeah, we've already done this with one of the Giga sites where they interface with an HPC, but to get there in a more general sense is exactly why we're moving to Singularity for the containers. So because nobody with an HPC is going to let us use Docker. So so that will, so exactly that. And other things that we're also looking at are, right now we've just kind of created our own format, and we can consume like CSVs and Nifties and things like that. Obviously, it makes it would make more sense longer term to consume bids, files, things like that. So we're moving in that direction.
JB.
Quick question for Vince. Thanks for the talk. That was wonderful. Did you think about the possibility of instead of putting some noise in the data to protect privacy, recreate data with the same sort of distribution, multivariate distribution, and do you know of any work that are actually comparing those two approaches?
Well, I mean, the noise I mentioned is from a specific distribution, right? So that may be what you were referring to.
I was referring to one approach is actually, instead of like putting some noise in the data, it basically re-randomize things, but in a way that you keep the multivariate distribution of your variables. So you really you are destroying any individual aspects, by re-randomization, but you are keeping the overall multivariate distribution to some degree, of course.
Yes.
Multiplying the data by pi or something? Is that what you're suggesting?
No.
I don't know.
That would be a bad algorithm.
I think you could. We haven't gone in that direction per se. We've more used kind of the standard differential privacy approaches thus far. There's no reason you couldn't do that though. You'd have to define which variables you wanted to preserve the distribution of, and kind of simulate that and see how well you can get it to work. But yeah. I think for these kinds of approaches, and I should say that I'm not a privacy algorithm expert. Anand Sarwate is our privacy expert. He's at Rutgers, and he may know of other things that are ongoing in that regard. I know there's a lot of work going on kind of in this general space. So.
Can I piggyback on that question, on JB's question a little bit, which is, if you have extreme biases at sites, which is possible with demographics or other aspects, a given algorithm by itself may not know that these other biases exist. So in a future plan, how do you think about this distributed or federated learning, which takes site-specific distributions, which could be highly skewed, into account?
Well, so there you're getting at really multi-site analysis generally, right? A lot of what the approaches that have been mostly used to date are really simple, like just scaling, right, or mean, or something like that. We've been playing more recently, and we don't have this in COINSTAC, but we could think about it at some point if it works well enough, is using something called the cycle GAN, which is a deep learning approach that basically creates. You've probably seen this in like Photoshop tools where you can basically restyle a picture based on a particular artist's style, right? Like a Mozart or Da Vinci or something like that. Or you can consider the object of an animal like a horse and a zebra to be fundamentally the same, and they just have different styles, right? Stripes or not stripes, right? And then we can think about sights as being something like that. And so that's and there's lots of approaches like that people are working on for harmonization across site. That's just one that we've been playing with more recently. But I think it's a tough problem. It's not solved. It's really interesting, and it needs to be continued to be researched. So,
somewhat about multi-site related. I wonder. So, typically people have NIFTs, or in clinical applications you work directly with DICOMs. Why am I asking? Because of my greedy interest is, do you know the date and time of acquisition? Because data is randomized. For me, it doesn't even need to be kind of shared, but is it known typically for the data you're analyzing? Let's say you're doing pre-processing, right? Do you do it already on not lobotomized, but converted DICOMs into NIFT, right? So you lose that information typically about when it was acquired.
Right. I mean, there's nothing special about what we're doing. I mean, we're mostly working with the research data at this point, although we're thinking about applications, to more sensitive clinical data, things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think you can imagine the local sites having that information and it not being shared, but potentially finding some way to compute, something useful from it that isn't exactly that, right? That might be informative. We haven't done that, at this point, but yeah. So
why I was asking, because we did a little study where we tried to use phantom data to explain some variance in the human participant data. Based on QA metrics on the phantom, because scanner its health fluctuates through time, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
your smoothness estimates, whatever, they will be affected by it, right? And then if that fluctuation also somehow is seasonally dependent, then it would be introduced into your data, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wondered if data was coming in with all these temporal information about date and time, right? And maybe then I could provide also some algorithm or a Docker container, pretty much, right? That if you had appropriate phantom data and you had subject data, you could extract those.
Right. Oh, in terms of yeah, basically you want to remove that information based on, calibrating against the phantom changes over time. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Then since I was talking, I saw that to describe your applications, let's put them this way, right? You describe what is the inputs parameters, what is the outputs parameters, right? Or whatever you get out. And there is already lots of similar schemas, right? For like gears, for flywheel, or bits app to some degree, although that one more loosely specified, or boutiques, right? I wonder if I could abuse COINSTAC by sticking just some standard, let's say, boutique container, right? And just using COINSTAC platform as my execution layer, right? So just which would forward all the data around, or I wonder if that is possible for abuse, or how easy.
Well, absolutely. I'm all for standardizing. The trick is though that we have both local and decentralized interfaces. So most so oftentimes you have to customize the algorithm a little bit, right, to that scenario. So, for example, if you're running the TSNE approach that we did, right? So it had another, it had another layer, which was we had this sort of common reference set and then we had individual sites, and you would run to convergence at your local site, and then you would have to run to convergence across the entire set relative to the reference set. So the algorithms themselves can vary, and they have to often be customized. But for things like pre-processing, it's pretty straightforward, and it should be able to. We should all be able to use the same thing if we can agree on what that is, right? So.
Or just have a mapping between them, right? So
Yeah.
if they are as expressive as each other, there should be mapping. If not, then yeah, we are in trouble.
Exactly. Yeah. It's great.
So yes, thank you for hosting Jarek and Julie, and thank you Vince and Theo for joining. But I wanted to thank you for joining us, and look forward to continuing our work together.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, hopefully it's helpful, and let us know if you have any questions or want to get involved. So yeah.